Awesome. Thanks, Ed. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, everyone. My name is George Zoto. I'm co-founder, co-organizers of Deep Learning Adventures, as well as a data scientist, data engineer for a nonprofit entity called Share Our Strength. This is my second chapter I'll be discussing with you today, and look forward to all the conversation and the questions and the comments we have. Again, this is a huge field, as Ted briefly mentioned, and we barely get to see some interesting concepts, but again, I'm looking forward to everybody participating and chiming in. Cool. With that said, I just posted the link both on Slack as well as here in the chat. This is a live presentation. I'll work a little bit on the very last slide with all the links. I have a lot of useful links throughout this chapter, and as well as other presentations that I've done on our other meetup. But for now, will be a combination of both the presentation as well as multiple resources that I found online. Awesome. So for those joining us online, we are covering the book by Aurélien Géron, Hands-on Machine Learning. This is the second edition. We'll cover the first part on traditional machine learning approaches, the first 9 chapters. And recently we delved into more newer approaches using deep neural networks. So we covered things like basic artificial neural networks, how do we train them, how do we customize them, how do we use the different loading and pre-processing techniques. That was the last session, using TensorFlow's ecosystem. And today we're going to talk a little bit about computer vision, which is chapter 14. A little bit of a background. I feel the chapter did a great job of motivating readers to learn more about computer vision, but in my experience, it lacked a little bit of just the very basic fundamentals of what exactly are we doing in the back end, and how do we actually implement this convolution operation. I think for me that was a missing link. So I've linked here several other resources that I've come across, and hopefully you can check them out. And hopefully they're useful. So a bit of background. We're motivated, again, you might have heard this before, but deep neural networks are motivated by the way that the human mind and human brain works. And actually there was a lot of research done, I think, in the 50s and 60s on animals, on cats, of how do they actually perceive images. And it was found by those papers that different neurons at different parts of the brain are responsible for absorbing information from an image from what is called a small receptive field. And that is basically an area in an image that somebody pays attention to. So different parts of the brain are focusing and paying attention to very small regions. They're basically looking for very, very small, what are called patterns, very small visual patterns. They may be looking for lines, they may be looking for horizontal lines, vertical lines, half circles, and things like that. But when they get combined into more and more in a network of such neurons, then that's where more complex and advanced patterns appear and are able to be detected. So then you can get combination of lines, which you can get like triangles and so forth, or half circles, you can get maybe a full circle. And even deeper in the network, you can actually see something that maybe looks like a house or an animal or things like that. So again, the author mentions in the book that when you look at something, your brain has already processed it in so many ways that you can't really tell what made you decide that this is a house or this is a cat or this is a dog. It just comes to you readily, simply because we have such an advanced vision system. So that's the motivation. And on the technical side, how do we actually teach a machine, or how do we actually teach a computer to detect patterns in vision? And back in the original literature, computer vision literature, things were heading in the direction of how do we find transformation, or how do we find some kind of mathematical operation that we can apply on an image that can look for patterns, and then we can combine those patterns into some kind of a detection system. So back in the early days, maybe we're looking at an image and we wanted to see, okay, if I'm detecting maybe fence, maybe I want to look for vertical edges. So how do I find a mathematical transformation of this image that pronounces or magnifies the vertical aspect of this image? Similarly for horizontal edges, similarly for like circles or square images or square objects and so forth. And here I have a resource from Andrew's and Coursera course on deep learning. I highly encourage you to check it out. It's it's a 2017 resource, but it's a fundamental resource on deep learning. But just to give you a little bit of a background of what we're actually talking about when we use the word transformation, in this concept we're going to talk about this convolution operation, and this is in the to be a little bit more mathematical in the cross correlation concept, and the author also mentions that in the book. So let's start with how do we actually use data or images in the tech world. Everything needs to be encoded by numbers, as you've seen it by now. So for now, we're going to work with abstract numbers without really defining them what object they represent, but just to define the basic mathematical operations, we're just going to work with these numbers for now, and then later on, we're actually going to use real images. Are there any questions behind the motivation or the pre-deep learning era operations? Okay, great. So we have a 6x6 matrix here. Again, the numbers don't really represent something. Think of them as presence or pixels or intensity. And what we want to do is somehow we want to detect vertical edges. That's our computer vision task. So to do that, we need to define somehow what is called a filter or a kernel, which is usually way smaller than the original input size. The input size in this case is 6x6. The filters are usually odd numbers like 3x3 or 5x5 or 7x7. And the numbers in them actually, the way we arrange them, determine what patterns we can detect. Let me annotate a little bit here. Trying to find the annotation button here. Okay. So in this case, if the filter is of this form, 1, 1, 1, 0, 0, 0, negative 1, negative 1, negative 1, you will see soon that this filter actually detects what is called vertical edges. And how is this applied to the original image? It's you take this two-dimensional array, you apply it on top of the original image, starting from the beginning, and you cell-wise multiply the input numbers from the image as well as with the kernel weights. You multiply them and you add them up. And if you do that for this 9 numbers and this 9 numbers here in the image, upper left, you'll get the number -5. You do this, you slide by 1, and you do this for the next block of 9 numbers and for the next block of 9 numbers, and then you slide down as well. Before I go how much you slide and what else do you do, let's look at this example here of why is this a vertical edge detection. So let's say our input is like this. We have 3 columns that have high intensity and 3 columns have low intensity. And we have a transition basically from maybe a bright background to a dark background. Using our filter here, and if you actually do the math, we're going to come up with this output, a 4x4 matrix, where the center 2 columns actually have high values and everything else is low values. So in a sense, we're trying to detect this transition from low intensity, from high intensity to low intensity. We can detect it right here in the middle, that there's something there transitioning from low values to high values. Cool. Then the other concepts that we need to be aware of, that was the convolution operation, are the concepts of padding and stride, so strided convolution. And the motivation here is that if we do this operation for all the pixels, we notice that pixels in the perimeter of an image are visited only less times than pixels in the middle of an image. So we have less overlapping squares here, especially the upper left one only gets visited once, all the corner ones, versus the ones in the middle gets performed in the operation, the convolution operation, multiple times. That's number one. Number two is if we keep doing this operation on an image, you'll notice that the output gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So if we have, as we'll see, a deep network of such convolutional operations, we can start with an image of 224 by 224 pixels, for example. It will shrink a little bit, it will shrink a little bit more, it will shrink a little bit more, till the end we have probably maybe a 7x7, what is called feature map, or 7x7 output. And as you can imagine, we kind of lost a lot of information there, so we need a way to somehow keep the original size as we go forward. So for those two reasons, the shrinking output problem, as well as not obtaining a lot of information from the edges, we introduced this concept of padding. And all that means is that we'll add a perimeter of zero-valued cells around the image. And that way, when we apply the convolution operation, the perimeter of the perimeter cells will actually be used multiple times as well, not just once. And also, if we do the math, we will figure out that the number of outputs based on the padding that we do can actually remain the same. So we can start with a 6x6. We can do zero padding, left, right, up and down. We can actually end up with the same number of width and height of the image, 6x6. The author also talks a little bit about two convolution types that we have. One of them is called valid, which basically means we don't do any padding at all. We take our input image, we apply our convolutional kernel, we get a smaller size output. That's the valid one. And same means what padding do we have to do so that the output the output dimension is equal to the input dimension. That's what it means. Cool. The other notation that is introduced is the concept of strided convolution. In this case, we're not sliding the window from left to right and from top to bottom by 1 pixel at a time. We can slide it by 2 pixels, 3 pixels, and so forth. And that's the hyperparameters that we get to choose. That's called the stride. So if in this case, if the stride is 2, once I start working on the 3x3 square here, if the stride is 2, I'll skip the second column, I'll jump to the third column. Similarly, when I go from the top square to the one underneath it, I will actually skip the second row, I'll go to the third row. And I'll get the output. So a little bit of output size here, because I mentioned width, height, kernel size, padding, and stride. How do they relate, and what is the output that we can expect? So let's say that our image is n by n pixels, and our filter here or convolution kernel is f by f. These are integers. And let's say we do a padding. In this case, we saw padding of just one cell around the perimeter, but we can actually do multiple layers. We can do another padding around the first padding and so forth. That's not common, but you can do that if you want to. The stride is how many times do I skip? How many times do I actually slide my window so that I don't look at each cell individually. So for this input and these parameters, the output size, if you do a little bit of math, is just n plus 2p minus f divided by s plus 1. And there's a lower bound here in case this ratio turns out to be non-integer. So that's this output size. And if you want what is called a valid padding, then there's a specific choice for p you can choose so that this is equal to n. Any comments so far? Okay. Cool. Again, the last thing I want to mention is, why are we introducing them, and what was wrong with simple, plain, deep neural networks or fully connected neural networks? They were able to operate on 1D arrays, on 1D input, and they were very specific of what patterns they picked on which specific part of the 1D input. So if, let's say, in the previous examples, when we had images and we're using simple DNNs, we actually flattened the image. We made it a very long vector. And our DNN now is able to pick patterns, but only at specific parts of the image. So for example, if I'm looking for circles, I might detect a circle in the beginning of the image, in a neighborhood of pixels. But my network should be able to detect circles wherever they are in the image, not just specifically to a region. So this concept of using basically of detecting patterns wherever they are and sharing those parameters is one of the reasons why we use them. So this parameter sharing is one reason. So we're actually operating now in a two-dimensional space. So images, as we perceive them, they're usually more than two, but for simplicity, let's assume that just width by height image. The other one is we don't need, as we saw with strides and parameters like that, we don't need to pay attention to every single pixel multiple times. Like we can actually have this sparsity of connection. So that's another reason that we can use convolution. And the other one is if we do this, and we'll see a chain of convolutions followed by probably by a simpler DNN. We can actually use gradient descent to actually train this whole network. But if there's something that you want to take away, is this is basically a generalization of a simple DNN, but operating now in 2 dimensions instead of 1 dimension. Cool. Last thing is just visually how this looks like. I'm going to start with the right part of the image. So let's say our image is actually composed of 3 what is called channels. Usually modern images have like a red, a blue, and a green channel. And let's say I have this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 by 5 image, which I've 0 padded. And this is the first channel. This is the second channel. This is the third channel. We're just displaying them as a column, so it's easier to visualize. Something to note, whenever I have multiple channels, my filters also need to have the same amount of channels. So if my input has 3 channels, my convolutional filter also have to have the same number of channels, which is the 3rd dimension. The width and the height can be anything, but the 3rd one needs to match, simply because each one of them will operate on its respective channel. So let's say I'm using for the first channel, I'm using these parameters, and the parameters can vary by channel as well. Maybe I'm looking something in the red channel, the green channel, the blue channel, or for satellite images where I have extra channels as well. Maybe I'm looking something in different frequencies. So these are the weights that I've chosen. Again, when we train a network, the network itself will figure out what parameters to use and what ways to use for the kernels that optimize our task or solve our challenge. So the first one is looking actually at a specific patch of the input image of the first channel. The second one is a specific patch of the middle channel, or the third one is a specific patch of the 3rd channel. And this will give me one output. And based on the math that we did of n plus 2p minus f divided by s plus 1. So this is one filter. And let's say that filter detects vertical lines. What if I want to detect also horizontal lines, or if I want to detect 45-degree lines, or what if I want to detect something else? Well, let's just add another filter, right? We can do that. So we do that. It has its own weights and bias. We can do that. We do the operation. And just to tie everything up, after this, we usually apply some kind of, so we use the bias here. After this, we apply some kind of nonlinearity function, like ReLU or some kind of other activation function, just to introduce the nonlinearities, because everything we've done right now is matrix multiplication, like linear operation. There's nothing nonlinear here. So our model needs to learn nonlinear patterns as well. So this is the visual, and I have the link here. And then from Andrews again book, course is how do we actually look at this now as a volume convolution. So our image has 3 channels, red, green, and blue. in our kernel, the third parameter needs to match the channel parameter. So the width and height in this case is 3. The channel also needs to match. So in this case, it's just 3. And the way to visualize this is I'm superimposing this volume, this 3 by 3 by 3, in the original image. I'm multiplying the numbers by the weights. I'm adding them up. And that's one output that I'll get. I do this, I slide from left to right, from top to bottom, based on the padding and the stride. In this case, there's no padding, the stride is 1. I'll get this 4 by 4 matrix. So I did that for one type of filter, let's say the vertical filter. I do that for another type of filter, the horizontal line or vertical line, the complementary one. I add the bias point to each cell. I apply the nonlinearity function, and I get this 4 by 4 by 2 because I had 2 types of filters output. So I started with 6 by 6 by 3 input, and now I have a 4 by 4 by 2. In reality, I have multiple such filters. In this case, I'm just showing 2. But in real life scenarios, as you go deeper into the network, the width and the height get smaller, but the channels get larger and deeper. Cool. So another concept is now these were the basic building blocks. How do we actually do convolutions? How do we do volume convolutions? What is stride? What is padding? And how do we actually stack them on top of each other? So as we've seen, this is the pattern that we use in deep learning, even for DNNs. So we have our input layer, we have a convolutional layer that looks at patterns. We have multiple of them that will generate its own output. Then we want to look for patterns within our first layer of patterns. We use another layer, the convolutional layer, and so forth. So we can do this as many times as we can, as long as the input, again, doesn't shrink too much. So this is the visual representation of it. And how do we actually do this in TensorFlow or Keras? In this case, would be within a sequential network, our model. We need to use the layers.conv2d constructor here. And in this case, 64 is the number of filters that we're going to use. In this case, previously I showed you 2. We're going to use 64. 7 by 7 will be our width and height of the filter. The activation we're going to use is ReLU. Padding is the same. Remember that our input will shrink. And the input shape, because this is the first layer, is in this case we're using a 28 by 28 by 1, probably MNIST input, which is a grayscale. That's why it only has one channel. 2 other concepts that the book quickly mentioned is one is the concept of max pooling. Maybe I can show this visually. Is instead of doing the convolution, we're basically picking the max out of a specific box. So if this is a 3 by 3, it will look at each 3 by 3 region. I'll just pick the maximum value. Next 3 by 3 region, I'll pick the maximum value. Next 3 by 3, I'll pick the maximum value. The same, instead of max, you can do the average operation here. These are used to reduce the computation size, because if you only use convolutional layers, you'll see that you have so many parameters and your input is staying the same, but basically it's harder and harder for you to train. So you're giving up a little bit of loss of information here because you're doing some kind of aggregation like max or average for the sake of, okay, this also needs to be computationally feasible. This max pooling then can be followed by multiple convolutional layers, but keep in mind that the channels are increasing. So we started with 64, now we're doubling them, 128, so it gets deeper. The kernel size gets smaller or stays about 3. Then the channel doubles again to 56, stays by 3. And then in the end, we're going to come up with this flatten layer, which basically flattens this volume into one large vector. And after that, we have a simple DNN with dropout layers and a softmax activation function to pick the class that is represented in this object. So in this network, we're trying to detect probably which digit we're looking at. Is it digit 0, 5, 9, and so forth. Awesome. I just wanted to show a visual of how the image looks like as it passes through this network. And I have this presentation, I have a link from another presentation that we did at Deep Learning Adventures. So we have this image here. This is a computer generated image of human. And we wanted to show how this looks like using different filters on the first layer, the max pool 2D. And these are just concatenated images just for you to have an idea. So the brighter the output is, that's the features that that filter is looking for or is magnifying. So the first filter maybe is looking something as straight lines. Second filter, not that much. This one is probably looking at not close, maybe the brightness or the face or the skin color. Maybe something is looking at the clothes color and so forth. So this is how the input looks like as perceived from different filters. Then we do the conv max pooling, conv max pooling. As you'll see, the image gets smaller and smaller. And the abstraction, what we're looking at, the features that we're looking at, is also called feature maps, get non-interpretable, like it's not clear to us what we're looking at. But there is information here, and that's what the last part of the network, the DNN, the deep neural network, we'll try to extract. Yep, I have links to the presentation here as well as our recording here in case you want to check it out on your own time. This is Convolutional Networks, as well as the volumes and other data augmentation transfer learning that we're going to look at. Cool. Any questions before we jump to some classical architectures of computer of CNNs?
Hey, George, a comment. So I love it. You hit so many of the key points. One of the things I didn't understand when I first learned convolutional layers is because the examples were very simple ones with only one channel input. And I didn't understand exactly what you have here, that the filter actually can have different numbers for each channel. So like if you were detecting only green grass, then maybe you would have zeros on the red and the blue, but you'd be looking for vertical lines that represent the grass, you know, on the green channel. And I didn't get that at first. One thing that I didn't catch you mentioning that you might want to just talk a little bit about is how after you do something like max pooling, the receptive field for the later layers gets larger just because you've sort of combined things. Did you want to? Yeah,
that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is this, from my understanding, is this computationally feasible operation. Like you're doing basically the save operations on your end, as well as this basically reduces your input size to a smaller number. So you end up with an output that's actually useful in your network, and you can train it. But please elaborate a little bit more on that. I'm curious, what do you mean by that?
Yeah. So what I'm getting at is that if your first layer is a CNN layer and you have a 3x3 filter, each filter can only see 3 pixels at a time in each direction. So 9 pixels total. So how could you ever then have long distance relationships? Like how many legs does this animal have? How many eyes does it have?
Got it.
You know, does it have wings? And so as you get deeper in the layers, if all you had was 3x3 filters stacked over and over and over and over again, eventually the receptive field would get a little bit bigger because right, like the filter that's 1 pixel below you is also getting some information from the pixel that's 4 down, right? And so then you get a little bit of signal from that, not the majority, but a little bit. And then, you know, if you go another layer eventually, but it would be very slow in terms of getting information from pixels that are farther away. Right. But if you do a 2x2 max pooling, then essentially the 3x3 filters that are after that automatically have double the receptive field. They're getting input now instead of from 3 pixels, from approximately 6 pixels in each direction, height and width. And then you do another 2x2 max pooling, and now those filters are getting an input from approximately, 12. I'm rounding off because there's, weird stuff. And so by the time you get to, say, the 20th layer, you can have something that actually is paying attention to the entire picture. So I don't know that you can take this super literally, but often people use the analogy that the first layers might detect, lines, and then later layers might connect those inputs into triangles, circles, squares, stripes, and then at a higher level, you may say, well, the combination of those looks like an eye, the combination of those looks like a mouth, the combination of those looks like a leg. And then eventually you say, if I see two eyes, a nose, a mouth, that's a face. So don't take it too literally, but that's the idea, is that they have a wider receptive field that they can look at, and they can combine these lower level features.
Right. That's a good explanation. Before we jump,
this is a really critical and important concept regarding CNNs. I think what Ted just went through there. The real reason for using, or the assumption going in on convolutional neural networks, is that you want to give your network this kind of inductive bias, right? That the relationships between pixel in the lower right-hand corner and a pixel in the upper left-hand corner are going to be very weak. So in contrast to a standard deep neural network, which would give you the ability to learn low-level features combining those, we give the ability only to learn low-level features from very small receptive fields, which helps you to generalize so that you can combine the learnings from what a circle looks like in one part of the image to what a circle looks like in the other part of the image, and you're training the same weights on those circles. But in order to put the big picture together, you need this kind of max pooling that eventually lets the receptive field get bigger with the feature level observations that you've learned from each of the lower levels. So now you're not really looking at pixel values and tiny edges to compare. You're saying, oh, this is an eye and another eye. Now combine these two together. So it's a really great picture to keep in mind.
Before we transition to some classical architectures, there's some resources that I'll paste in the last slide, but I'll just quickly go over them. So one of these Coursera book, a Coursera resource that I'll share as well. The other one is this concept of cross correlation and convolution, and what is the difference between them. I'll share the link there as well. The other one is just a 3D representation of convolutional neural network and detecting handwritten digits. So let's say I'm going to write the number 2 here. And this is my input here. You can actually go closer and so forth. And then for each, this convolutional layer 1, you can actually see which part of the image is it looking at. And based on the values, maybe it's looking for curves, maybe it's looking for straight lines or vertical lines and so forth. But you can see I have multiple of them in my first convolutional layer. Then I have maybe a max pooling layer here that is maybe looking at the maximum value in that region. And you can kind of see here what is it looking for. Then I have another convolutional layer that's combining this. You see here, as you were talking about that receptive field, right? I'm looking at multiple parts of the image now in the second layer, followed by another. This is called downsampling layer here. That's probably max pooling or average pooling. And then I have 2 fully connected layers. And you see the fully connected layers are actually looking at information across the, what are these called now? Feature maps. So if you see them, they're actually all of them. Then I have another fully connected layer followed by the actual softmax operation here. This will keep the one that has the highest value. So yeah, this is what the network looks like on a three-dimensional presentation. You can try and trick the network. So let's say this is a 4. So it's between a 4 and a 9. First guess is 9 for some reason. Maybe I can trick it to be like something. So it's a 9. First guess is 5. I don't know why, but maybe I make it an 8. Oh, okay, first guess is 8. Maybe if I make it a 0 or something like a 0, fix it up. I found that useful. This CS231N also has some nice renderings, and this is why I borrowed the this resource as well of how the convolution looks. And let's see, there's another resource I wanted to share. This is actually a network trained on TensorFlow JS using the CIFAR10 dataset. And let's say resume. So as it is trained, you can see the activations of how the image, so this is the input image, looks like as you go through the layers. So let me zoom in a little bit. So this is the first convolutional layer. This is after applying ReLU, max pooling, another convolution, another ReLU, pooling, another convolution. You see it gets smaller and smaller. And then what is the actual output? And this is just the test accuracy on some random images on the test set from that data set, CIFAR10. Cool. Oh, this is a great resource. I'll link this to as well. I find this really useful. On the left, we have an image. This is an image of a boat. And you can see here the red, the green, and the blue channel. And then over here, I have a convolutional ReLU. So if I click on it, we'll actually get to see the actual operation of convolution. So this is the operation of convolution, as you can see on all 3 channels, and the bias. You can also see on the second layer how that looks like. It's looking at a higher, as you mentioned, right? The receptive field is getting higher now on the second layer, and how that looks like. Max pooling as well, another convolutional ReLU, all the way to the output. And here you can actually see after it's flattened, where are the different contributions coming from. And I think if you click on it, you get to see the actual values. So yeah, this team has a nice tutorial here, a nice YouTube tutorial of how to use this resource, but I find it really useful and really interactive, where you can actually get to see the different values, operations. Yeah, I have a nice tutorial here. I'll link this too. Cool. Then before we jump in, we need to talk a little bit about ImageNet, which is a data set that Stanford and Faith Haley and her team, Professor Faith Haley, developed over time. But basically, these are annotated images. So the challenge is an image can detect something, but we need to tell it what is that something in the image. And that means we as humans need to label images. And that's usually the most the costly part of the machine learning project. You can check this out. This has been going on for many years. And each year there's a computer vision architecture that that is spin up as a challenge all the way from 2010. And each year, an architecture that wins that challenge is usually, considered state of the art, and people use it for different tasks. Speaking of that, the other resource is this this papers with code where you can see the different networks we're going to look at, how they have performed on ImageNet over time. But let's switch to this ImageNet challenge.
Hey,
so,
George.
go ahead.
I had a question. So you had this human thing. So a basic question is that if we have more deeper convolution layers, the image becomes smaller. If you see here, yeah,
right.
Exactly this slide. So does it mean that we will actually lose sight of the big picture, or because I didn't see that in the kayak one, but here it seems like as if after the max pooling 2D4 layer, the one at the very bottom, it becomes very small. So what are the implications of having a deep convolution neural network?
Right. So the spatial information, you're right, the spatial coverage is getting smaller and smaller within the height, but the channel, which is not shown here, because there's so much space we can show, we're only showing one channel, gets deeper and deeper. So if I wanted to show this image in 3 dimensions, this would be maybe 3 channels here, then maybe based on how many channels I use for the convolutional layer, maybe 12, 64, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512. So this is getting deeper and deeper. So the information, width and height wise is small, but the channels are increased significantly. That's how the information is preserved, and it's refined information. It's not just, it doesn't look like something that we can interpret. It's refined and encoded by the network.
Oh, so you mean to say that red, green, blue, those channels are increasing?
Yes. So,
okay.
So yeah, here in this visualization that I showed, there's only 2 filters, but see here, I start with 64 of them. So my channels jump to 64, then they jump to 128, then they jump to 256. So by the end, yeah, a very small patch of information, but it has multiple 256 channels, and that's how the information is preserved. So that's basically the presentation of the image from the model. That's how the model is able to represent its image internally. It's like an embedding. It's something you'll see in the next chapter. It's basically, how do I take a 256 by 256 by 3, an image, and based on the task you gave me, how do I encode it in this small, maybe 4 by 4 by 256 vector, so that this means car, this means person, this means boat, this means dog.
Okay.
So one bit I'd like to add here is a lot of people think of these tasks sort of like compression. So you start with this massive, super high dimensional, like you can take 1920 by 1080 by red, green, blue channels, and then eventually you're compressing it all the way down to 1,000 different classes or 10 different classes or something like that. So that like reduction that we're seeing is actually what we want. We want to be throwing away a bunch of information until we synthesize it down to exactly the bits of information that we want. So that's actually, that's our goal, is to reduce it down eventually to just those tiny bits of information rather than the whole image. And that's different depending on what task we're doing. Like if we were doing object detection or something like that, we would want to keep that positional information. But because we're just classifying, does this image have a dog or not, we're trying to compress it down and get rid of a lot of that actually.
Yep.
Yes, I think you guys covered it, but just to make sure it's clear, George said, you have more channels, and I just want to make sure it's clear that, like Ryan was saying, that we expect that the information in each of those channels in the later layers has more complex meaning. So again, don't take this too literally, but it could be that one of the quote unquote pixels, it no longer means positional things, right? It's just what one of the data elements means has a face. One of them means how many legs do I see? It could be 2, it could be 4, it could be 8 if it's a spider. Does it have eyes? Is it brown? Is it red? There are different things that those things could mean that are much more, does it have fur?
Right.
Things that are more complex than just like, I see a vertical line, I see a circle or something like that. So that's how you can have a smaller number of those data elements. Like Ryan was saying, you're compressing it into these semantically, bigger concepts.
Yeah.
One other thing I want to add is earlier in your slides, you showed some like edge detection filters. And those have always been satisfying to me to look at, because it's like, okay, someone went through and they figured out, oh, we put all the ones over here and the negative ones over there, and then that gets us to horizontal lines. And someone spent a bunch of time kind of engineering and figuring out how to do that. And that's what this convolutional neural network process is doing, is it's learning those filters. And so it's going beyond, like, no human could necessarily go through and go, okay, I have to pass it through 64 layers of filters, and then now it's going to magically understand what a dog looks like. But the network can figure out those numbers for us. Because if we just said, okay, draw an edge detector, and then here's some squiggly line detector, and then whatever else, we would never be able to hand engineer that. It's just too complicated. But magically, the network is able to learn the filters that allow us to do that.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Switching gears to this ImageNet challenge that you see. Let me talk a little bit about this network architecture that was revolutionary, and I'll borrow this from another presentation. But back in 1998, LeCun and Benji and others introduced this network called the Net5, and basically that was what we now consider as a classical example of classical network in computer vision, where you have a 32 by 32 by 1, a grayscale image, and this can be handwritten digits, and you apply a series of convolution, average pooling, convolution, average pooling, convolution, average pooling, and a fully connected layer, softmax. And that was the first combination of convolutional layers as well as fully connected layers that kind of inspired similar architectures going forward. I think the book mentioned something about 20, if I remember correct, 27% accuracy error rate on the MNIST. I'm not sure. So it wasn't, back then it was like, it had great performance, but now if you use this on a simple MNIST, I think you'll get a decent performance. But it was one that basically started this whole branch of let's stack multiple convolutional layers followed by a fully connected layer. So in the book, the table is read from bottom to top. And you have your input, which is 32 by 32 by 1 channel. One is not mentioned here. Then you have a convolution, a 5 by 5 kernel. Your image gets reduced by 28 by 28. You do average pooling at 2 by 2. This gets cut in half, so 14 by 14. You apply a 5 by 5 convolution. The output is 10 by 10. Cut in half, 5 by 5 convolution, 1 by 1. You make it a long vector, feed it to fully connected, and you apply softmax here. And the paper applied another activation function that's not used anymore, but that was the classical 1998 architecture that inspired many other ones.
Oh, quick thing here. After the C5 convolution, won't you actually apply a flattened layer?
Yeah, it's not shown here, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Josh, can you go back to your previous slide? I had a question on that.
This is from the paper.
So, yeah. So this is a very classic thing. So I was doing in my work stuff, and I was actually applying the CNNs for actually transformers plus CNNs for my language learning, and my boss saw like 147 million parameters, and here you've shown 60K parameters. So, although he has a PhD in math and all that, and he was kind of surprised. I think he forgot, but because I had done this long time back, he said, your model will overfit because, obviously we had only few thousand examples and we are actually optimizing upon 60K parameters. So, logically it makes sense if you have, let's say, 2000 examples and now the network has 60K parameters. It will obviously, the number of samples are less than the number of parameters. So how would you actually explain to somebody in this sense? I mean, I can actually tell, like, some of the transformer-based networks, they like BERT and all that, they have millions of parameters. So it was actually millions, and I was training upon 2 million examples. But how would you explain this one? Like, won't it overfit?
Yeah, I mean, that's always a challenge. And again, I don't think I'm looking for a solution where my number of input or instances is higher than the number of parameters. That'd be ideal. But with modern architectures with millions or hundreds of millions, billions, I think we're close to trillions now. There's no way you're going to find that data set. One thing that people do is called data augmentation. I'm briefly going to touch upon it, but yeah, there's the modern architectures are so complex that you're not going to find a rich enough data set that can come up with. And you're absolutely right. You are on the risk of overfitting, and there are a few things you can do, like regularization and so forth. But maybe try, usually the approach is you try with a smaller network, see what accuracy or whatever metric you're looking for, you get. And if that gives you decent enough output, you upper parameter tune it and regularize it. But yeah, don't start with state of the art for something very simple. It will definitely overfit. I mean, there's no guarantee about that.
Yeah. Okay.
There's no doubt about that. I mean.
Yeah, so I would say that's a great question. For like a complete layperson, they're not going to understand that question. But for like a scientifically minded person, I would say that is the fundamental amazing thing about deep learning. Because with that many parameters, it clearly could overfit. But something about the way we do the neural network architectures, and in particular that we use gradient descent to optimize them, tends to create smoother outputs, which are not then able to sort of pathologically overfit, right? So if I change one pixel in an image, it can't just give a completely different output. I mean, hypothetically, it could, right? With that many parameters, it could do anything bizarre. But no CNN we've ever built does that, where you change one pixel by a tiny bit and the output changes by a million. No, you change one pixel by a tiny bit and the output will change by a tiny bit. And so because these are smooth functions, they can't overfit the way, in the classic example, if you do linear regression, you change it to polynomial regression. Yeah, if you have 100 input values and you do a polynomial of degree 200, you can perfectly hit every point and overfit. But that is not a smooth function. That then becomes, right, a very, jaggy function. And so I don't know that anybody has the perfect theoretical answer, but I think the general answer is that something about the linear layers are not that complex, and so the linear layers, the activations, and the gradient descent means that your output is relatively smooth. There's now I'm forgetting, but yes, there are papers that talk about that. I think that is like the great thing about deep learning, that if you told someone before deep learning that you were going to do this, they would say exactly what your friend said. Like, isn't that crazy? Aren't you just going to overfit? Won't work. But it will work if your outputs are sort of smooth.
So Ted, actually, to your point, I do agree, but there's a counterpoint which actually brings forth a new area of research called adversarial machine learning. And in that, they have actually shown by changing one pixel, the output totally changed. Actually, by adding almost noise, it changed. But that's probably a topic for another discussion. So at this point, I would agree with your answer.
Yeah. No, it is definitely definitely true that if your original image has, let's say it's 200 by 200, it's 40,000 pixels. You can do an exhaustive search of all 40,000 pixels, and you will find one of them that has more effect on your output prediction than any of the other 39,000 pixels, right?
Right.
And maybe you can find some combination of 3 pixels if you have a borderline image that can flip it from, you know, panda to monkey, whatever, right? But broadly speaking, it's not overfitting the way, like in our classic examples of polynomial regression, where we can say this is massively overfit. So yes, I would not defend that they're perfect, but I would say that it's that's the reason why they don't just ridiculously massively overfit to the training set.
I'm just showing here some examples from LeCun's website of using LeNet, but different variations of input. So maybe translation, how robust is the network to translation? So I'm actually moving my input to different parts. I'm scaling it. I'm rotating it. I'm squeezing it. You know, I'm changing. I'm adding noise. I'm converting numbers from one to the other. You know, this is what's called like ablation studies in recent papers, but this is something, yeah, that we need to keep an eye on.
I just want to add to this, but there are some things which we use, which are actually regularization. We add regularization when we drop out at dropout layer. We add noise, as already George said, when we do modifications like moving our image left, right, angling it a little bit and such and such.
Right.
What else? We add regularization when what else is there? When we do max pooling and we reduce the image, it is a kind of regularization too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in terms of training set, something called data augmentation or image data augmentation is you can take an image and you can rotate it, you can crop it, you can scale it, you can adjust the brightness. And these are for objects that are that symmetry is not that important, but you, for example, you cannot flip it upside down. It wouldn't make much sense. Similarly for letters or numbers, but you can do like for small variations of it. And basically you go from a data set size of X to, if you do, let's say 6 transformations to 6X. So you go from like 10K images to like 60K images. Even though when you train it in TensorFlow and you do this kind of operations, the data set doesn't get multiplied by, you know, doesn't get 600% increased. It's just that it picks the original image, it transforms it, and then gives it to your model. So it does it on the fly. But you can do some kind of pre-processing technique where you do this kind of data augmentation techniques, and your data set size went from like 10K to 60K images. But again, if you have the picture of the same flower, there's also a distribution importance, right? If the input is from the same distribution, you know, no matter how much you rotate it, scale it, it's still not enough information there. It needs to be, variety needs to be there, diversity needs to be there. Cool. So that was a LeNet fight that inspired a generation, I would say, of other networks. Another one, this is the winner, I think, of 2012 ImageNet, which was similar to LeNet. The input size here is 227 by 227, again, trained on ImageNet, which has 1,000 classes and over 1 million images. Convolutional max pooling, 3 convolutional max pooling, you know, flattened, and then fully connected, and 1,000 classes here. I have to go back to the book. I think this was in the 20-something% error rate, if I'm not mistaken. And as the years progressed, you can actually see it here in this paper's with code. So 63% accuracy, yeah. And then as different architectures were increased or introduced, you know, the accuracy kept increasing. Cool. So that was the augmentation. The other one is that was introduced in a later, I think this was 2014 or 2016, was this inception idea of basically having these blocks, and you'll see this often in modern architectures where new blocks of advanced operations are introduced. So we have a one-by-one convolution. There's a whole introduction, there's a whole discussion about one-by-one convolutions. Of course, we won't get time to go over it, but think of them as a way of this. The author mentions that the combination of a 3x3 convolution following a 1x1 is actually looking at patterns across channels. So far what we've seen is we're actually looking for patterns in the two-dimensional space, and we have different filters for different channels, but we're actually looking at patterns in the two-dimensional space. This combination actually allows you to look at patterns across channels. Not that you cannot do it now, but it's not as typical. And then with the introduction of this inception module, you see this this network of convolutional max pooling, something called local response normalization, convolutional max pooling, then 9 or 10 of these inception modules, followed by global average pooling, which basically takes your 2D input and just averages the whole thing, and you get one number. Followed by a dropout and a DNN based on how many units we have. This is ImageNet, so it's 1,000 units. Again, the book has a better description and an in-depth description, as well as the paper of what exactly is happening. Then there were more neural architectures, and something that is common in deep neural networks is that the deeper you get, as backpropagation works, only the top layers, the ones that are actually close to the output, get updated, simply because of the vanishing gradient problem. As you go closer to the input, the gradients are so small that these weights are not updated at all. So to solve that, the concept of this residual units is introduced, where or residual learning, where you actually allow this channel to be added to your output. So you pass your input with multiple layers, as well as the input of previous layers to the output. So you have these skip connections. What that allows you is, when backpropagation is the gradients are flowing backwards, they actually have another channel now to make their way back. And this recent architecture using this residual modules, convolution, as well as skip connection, multiple of them stacked. This was also one of the winners for ImageNet in later years. Then another one was this squeeze and excitation network, where you actually have a block now, but that block is actually a small neural network that tries to figure out which channels to pay attention to, which channels to upgrade or downgrade, what is called recalibrate, based on your task. So that was the SE, and you have the SE version of inception, which is basically inception followed by the squeeze and excite block, or the SE resonate version of it. And then again, there's just the SE block is just the global average pooling, a dense and a dense. And this is called the bottleneck layer, simply because it has less neurons than the input and the output. So it allows basically the network to condense the knowledge of the input. So yeah, let's go back to the papers with code. And you'll see AlexNet, which we saw. Some of them we didn't see. Inception, the one that has the inception module. There are multiple versions of it. Then the ResNet back in 2017, 80% accuracy. Keeps increasing. Some other ones all the way to now, which are probably transformer based now by now, I think. And yeah, so you can look at them, look at the paper, look at the code, but this is where computer vision and NLP kind of merge here with this transformer based models.
So George, I would say that if there's just one sort of overarching theme in how they've all used convolutional layers,
Right.
and how these CNNs evolved is it tends to be, we now use smaller filters and we use more layers. So when you looked at the early ones, the LayNet, the AlexNet, you might see a 7x7, 11x11 initial filter. You might see a 5x5 near the beginning. You pretty much never see that anymore. It's very small filters, mostly 3x3s.
Yeah.
And more deeper models. But then basically you have to solve problems, like you said, of the vanishing gradients. And so I think ResNet is probably the biggest concept there, because even if it's not that exact architecture, you see these skip connections in transformers, you see these skip connections in pretty much every deep architecture, no matter what problem it's solving, whether it's vision or something else.
Exactly, yeah. Then how do I actually use this network, right? So we saw multiple of them. Which one do I use and how do I use it? And how do I actually, start a project around it? And, in the book, you have very few basic lines of if you want to call a model that was pre-trained on ImageNet is just a one-liner in Keras or TensorFlow. So for example, in Keras, it's Keras applications, you want ResNet 50, which is a version of the ResNet network. You can just call ResNet 50 with weights pre-trained on ImageNet. If you want exception, you just do exception weights ImageNet. And you have the option, many of these networks have a fully connected layer and a softmax activation function that's trained on 1,000 images or 1,000 classes. If you want to exclude that, you do include top equals false, and then you can add your own DNN on top of it with as many classes as you want. So for example, ImageNet has 1,000 classes. If your project is trying to do image classification on something that is part of this 1,000 classes, you can use ImageNet. It's a good start. It's been trained on multiple classes. So if you're trying to detect specific types of boats, boat is one class in ImageNet. You can start with that and then fine tune it based on your own data set. Then you can add again your own average pooling, your own dense layer, how many classes you have, and then your model will be your base model input as well as the output. You use your own stochastic gradient descent optimizer, sparse categorical cross entropy as your loss function, and you can, just for verification, you can print accuracy. You can train for as much as you want. You can get a callback to save the best model, or maybe use some kind of learning rate schedule or some kind of other metric to stop training on early stopping, basically based on improvement or not in the validation set. So very few lines, you can get pretty good results. Cool. The next thing that the author talks about is the concept of, so far the task has been given an image, tell us if there is something in it. So is there a cat in the image? Is there a dog in the image? Is there a flower in the image? Is there an iris flower in the image? What if we wanted something more precise? We want to know if there is that object in the image, but also where it is. So this is where the concept of localization comes. And now our model needs to output 5 things. One is what is the probability that the object is there? Let's say we're detecting iris flowers. So probability is between 0 and 1. That's one output, as well as where it is in the image. Is in the middle, upper left, lower right. So I need 4 numbers. I need the XY coordinates of the center of the box, what is called a bounding box, because it surrounds it, as well as what is the width and the height of that bounding box. Could be narrow, could be wide, could be tall, and so forth. So now we see that this is a little bit more involved task than the simple, okay, yes, there is a flower in the image. And one metric that we can use is, so we have label data, and that's actually the expensive part of this project. We actually have to label all these images. We have to draw bounding boxes around them. And one way to determine if our model is picking up or is able to solve these challenges is we look at what is the intersection of our prediction in red with the actual label in green. So that's the intersection here that's shown in this dark region, over what is the union. So how far was I off? I'll get penalized the further away I am. So how close am I to the original label that I wanted on a numerator? How far am I off? I'll get penalized by that. That ratio is the intersection over union, and that's used as a metric. And then the book talks a little bit about earlier approaches of how do you solve this. And one would be maybe you do image classification on different patches of the image and on different sizes of the patches. So maybe I'm looking for a flower in this 3x3. Maybe I'm looking for a flower in the sequential one. So basically we're like acting like a convolutional filter. We're sliding our model, and if it detects something, we record that. And as you can see, if I have, let's say, multiple flowers, and I'm detecting flowers here, roses, my model will output multiple predictions because they might be very close to each other. And the book talks a little bit about this non-max separation, but basically the idea is that the prediction, the stronger prediction, the one that is closer to the label, actually is the one that wins. So you might start with multiple outputs, but at the end of the day, after you do some kind of post-processing, you only get a very small number of outputs. There are finer techniques. This actually, you're looking at the image, what is called multiple times, because you're sliding the window multiple times, and it's not that cost effective. There are other more modern techniques which they only look at the image once, and they can actually detect where exactly the object is in the image. The books quickly covers them. I don't think we have enough time to cover them today, but another thing I wanted to mention was this another task called semantic segmentation. So we've talked about, yes, there is a flower there, where it is. What if I want to detect, I want to classify now at the pixel level, where does that pixel belong to? So is that a pixel of a building? Is that a pixel of a person? Is that a pixel of a car or of a bicycle and so forth? That's called semantic segmentation. If I want to go one deeper level, and if I actually want to distinguish between bicycles, that would be called instance segmentation. So if I want to detect or draw pixels around specific bicycles, that would be another example of instance segmentation. Cool. That's what I had. I have a couple more resources that I came across that I quickly share with you. One of them is this interesting concept of capsule networks that Aurélien Géron mentioned, that Hinton introduced a while ago. And actually, Aurélien has a nice presentation on them. But in the end of the chapter, he talks about, okay, what is next? What other exotic, architectures are there? And he did a video a while ago. This is a video of something called You Only Look Once, YOLO. That's basically a really fast object detection model. This is another resource I'll share with you of how the input looks like as it passes through the output. And this is the capsule network that I wanted to share. But basically the idea is that you look for patterns, and a combination of patterns is a strong indication that something larger is present there. So in the example that we mentioned a little bit before of eye, and nose, when you see maybe two eyes, you expect to see a nose. And if your model outputs an output of a nose that is very low in probability, maybe you'll boost that up because usually they show up together. Some other resources, speaking of image detection and so forth, I have a notebook here on Kaggle that basically explores multiple models, not only that, but also different hyperparameters. So in the x-axis, I have different models that I tried. I did like a couple of Christmases ago, as well as different hyperparameters. So maybe I tried different pooling, optimizer, dropout, pigmentation, parallel, additional data, pre-trained at different weights, and so forth. And you can see I also have the size of the model, but how the accuracy improved by different fine tunings that I did, or by different maybe assembling methods that I use. And the last thing is, if you want to see an example of an end-to-end project, our deep learning adventures group did this over last summer, where we actually went through an end-to-end project of collecting images of ourselves and drawing bounding boxes and training a model end-to-end on how to do this. And I'll share the link and everything you need with us. We also have the recording here. We're able to deploy this on an app, an Android app. We actually take photos and we can do custom face detection that detects specifically our faces. I have here more examples if you want to get an idea, but we tried with sunglasses, without sunglasses, you know, different exclusions, different backgrounds, with mask, without mask, with hats, and you know, it was pretty decent, I would say. We got pretty decent results. Yeah, I have the recording here. I'll share it as well. Yeah, you can check it out. Cool. And as well as I didn't go over the notebook of the book simply because out of time, but yeah, that's also a good one. Check it out. Talks about basic filters, different translations, different layers, MNIST, pre-trained model, and so forth. I think, yeah, that was the Kaggle notebook, the custom face detection. And I'll link all these resources that I mentioned in this notebook. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, George.
All right, thanks, George. Yeah, whirlwind tour through computer vision. Love all the resources. I don't know if you had a chance to see in the chat. So early on, someone posted, looks like we don't have permissions to the document that you shared. But since you're going to be making edits anyway, we might as well wait till you have all the links and stuff for us to download. One thing I wanted to mention, we didn't have too much time to talk about it, but you know, we talked about briefly, you covered object detection and then semantic segmentation. There's a very famous architecture called UNet, and the book describes they added skip connections immediately after the paper that they reference. Somebody built more skip connections, and when you do that, you sort of start with like bigger images, and then they get smaller, you know, as you do the max pooling, and then these skip connections, it gets bigger in the end, and so it's kind of a U shape, and that's why they call it UNet. But for segmentation, that is a very basic, famous architecture, not mentioned in the book. And then the other thing I'll say is that in 2 chapters, the book does get to transformers, but at the time of publications, transformers had not yet completely taken over the world. So they will be mentioned. There's not a lot talked about the famous architectures. So we will probably want to get into that. I don't know, Ryan, if we want to try and do a supplemental session at some point. But a key thing to know is that people have been trying to see whether or not they can use transformers in the place of convolutional layers instead of CNNs. And some people are doing it just as a theoretical exercise, and some people are doing it to try and get like state-of-the-art performance. But the reality is that maybe in the end, we're better off using a mix of convolution and transformers, but people have been able to build transformer-only architectures. Some of them steal a lot of lessons from CNNs. They do something that looks a lot like max pooling, even though it's not max pooling. But people are, so if you want to know what is the cutting edge in terms of performance, I don't know that the models might be huger and they might be more expensive and they might be slower, but nevertheless, in terms of like accuracy, the transformers have managed to displace CNNs just in terms of like raw accuracy.
Yeah.
So vision transformer, VIT, would be a good place to start. It's a relatively simple architecture that uses transformers only.
I think, Ted, as you mentioned, this is very recent trend. I think maybe last 2 years only that vision transformers have been talked about.
Yeah, VIT I think is less than 2 years old, and
Right.
and then other things have sort of built on that, and there's a few other variations. Any questions? Anything else for George? All right. Thanks again, George. That was awesome.